for joining me, everyone. Chuck Morse here. Welcome, Avi Lipkin. Avi is an author. He's a politician. Apparently, he's launched a new political party in Israel. He is joining us from Israel. Avi, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Good to be on your show again.
All right, Avi, I haven't talked with you in many, many years. Years ago on my regular radio program, I interviewed you as the author of Is Fanatic Islam a Global Threat? A book that you wrote 10 years before the horrendous events of 9/11, and you predicted that. I wish we had listened to you. I wish our leaders had listened back then. You were like a canary in the minefield. You know, you were like, in a sense, the way Winston Churchill tried to warn Europe in the 1930s about Hitler and Nazism, simply because he read Mein Kampf and took it seriously, and everyone else was saying he was like out in the wilderness until things became too obvious to ignore. So in a sense, you're quite prophetic, but I think that your prophecy is not based on anything particularly magical. It's based on the fact that you got feet on the ground and you're observing events of your own time, both literally in the political sense, but also philosophically. What are the ideas behind this fanatic war against the Western democracies, against Israel, against the United States? So, I'm pleased that you've been working in the fields on this topic, and, I feel proud to have had you on my show. Now, Avi, I want to talk about, before we get into the issue of your developing a new political party in Israel, the Bible Bloc Party, I just want to ask you a political question that's sort of practical and that's on my mind and I think on the minds of many Americans, and that is, what do you think about recent comments and actions by President Trump with regard to the withdrawal of American forces from Syria and possibly Afghanistan? Is that a good thing? How is that going to affect Israel, and how is it going to affect the entire region?
Well, as an aspiring, I don't want to say young politician because I'm not so young anymore. Tomorrow actually is my 70th birthday.
Yeah.
So I'm not young anymore, but I do have a lot of experience. And we are looking at President Trump in his second year of office, getting ready for the elections in 2 years. In other words, the question of Afghanistan, the question of Syria, these two questions take kind of like a back seat to the realities of a new election campaign. Excuse me. So I think that, America kind of has been having to to be like the American military has had to kind of been like a yo-yo, going in, going out, going in, going out, according to the political expediencies of American politics. And President Trump is very attuned to promises that he has made to the American people. And of course, one of the promises is to get the American troops out of the Middle East and bring them home. The problem is that the Middle East is a very bad neighborhood, and there is no such thing as a vacuum. So if the United States pulls out, ISIS develops and moves in. That's what we saw with President Obama. A president who wants to be isolationist is going to find in the end that the vacuum is filled by a lot of bad guys. And then America has to go in and clean up again. So I wouldn't be surprised if after all, the United States does pull out of Syria, which I'm not so sure, the United States will have to come back at some stage. You have a war festering between the Kurdish people and the Turks. And actually, the Kurds are doing the next best thing, probably with the American blessing, which is to sign a deal with the Syrian army, Syrian government, and the Russians, so that these two powers protect them from the Turks. The Turks see the Kurds as a mortal enemy. Until now, the Americans have been protecting the Kurds. A lot of people, even here in Israel, look at the Kurds as a very, very betraying group of people. They're with you one day, and then another segment of the Kurds is against you, and they fight each other. This is very typical of the Middle East. Israel has overall found the Kurds to be a reliable ally. But again, there have been times in the Kurdish history that you had, I wouldn't say anti-Israel groups, but you had groups that would align themselves with Iran, for example. So this would be seen as a hostile action in Israel. But overall, I don't like to use the word, prophecy. But in the end, I see ISIS coming back to the fore in Syria, especially if the United States pulls out. For the Russians, this is going to be a Vietnam. It's going to be a Afghanistan too. Don't forget the Russians got seriously beaten in Afghanistan, and they had to withdraw in 1989.
Right.
I think that President Trump is pulling out the American troops in order to let the Russians stew in their juice there in Syria with the Iranians. The Iranians also are paying a very, very high price for their presence in Syria. ISIS is not defeated. ISIS has been battered down, but ISIS is still there. I'm saying things now which most Americans don't really know,
Right.
and that even King Abdullah of Jordan is facing a very grave internal threat from ISIS. The King of Saudi Arabia, Salman, and his son Mohammed bin Salman, facing a very, very grave threat from ISIS. I'm not defending the Saudi regime and Mohammed bin Sultan for the crazy execution of Khashoggi, the journalist. But Khashoggi was ISIS. Khashoggi was Muslim Brotherhood. And so this is every Middle Eastern country is facing internal wars. And it's not like the United States has a neighbor like Canada. And I mean, I wish we had a neighbor like Canada.
Who doesn't, right?
I wish we had,
Yeah,
I wish we had the United States or Switzerland this is not Scandinavia. This is the Middle East. It's a crazy place. And the only thing that'll keep you alive is having a good defense, good military. So I think that Trump is maneuvering himself in a way so that he can keep his word to the American people during election time. But I also think that the Israeli interests are being covered and protected by President Trump, even if the United States withdraws how many 2,000 soldiers from Syria? That's at some stage. I don't know how it's going to be programmed, but I think that Israel and America are covering their bases very carefully.
And there's also rumors that Iran is about to implode. There's evidence of that maybe the mullahs are on their way out. And Secretary of State Pompeo is in the Middle East next week talking with leaders. And there's talk about the discussion of creating a Middle East version of NATO, like a mutual defense pact between various Middle East nations, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and I think maybe Turkey and Egypt. Do you have any information on that? And what about Iran?
Okay, well, regarding Middle Eastern NATO, I don't think it's a reality. I don't think it's a possibility, because, like I said before, I didn't say before the theory that I have a theory called the one bullet theory. But the one bullet theory is one bullet kills King Abdullah of Jordan, ISIS takes over. One bullet, King Salman in Saudi Arabia, ISIS takes over. ISIS has promised to wipe out the Shiites in Syria and Lebanon, and there's this constant war in Iraq between the Shiites and the Sunnis. ISIS has promised to kill the Kurds. ISIS has promised to kill the Druze. Druze are a people that are to be found in Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. The Christians, of course, are to be killed. All of this part of the ISIS plan. And so a NATO in the Middle East would be in countries that are inherently unstable. Because Jordan falls, that's it for Jordan. Saudi Arabia falls, that's it for Saudi Arabia. And Turkey, of course, is going along the path of Muslim Brotherhood, which is just another form of ISIS, in my opinion.
Right. All right. Avi Lipkin's my guest. His books are all available at his website, avilipkin.net. Avi, you are spearheading a new political party in Israel, the Bible Bloc Party. Talk about that a little.
Okay, well, I'm 70. The last 20 years, Huh?
Yes, go ahead.
The last 28 years, however, I've been spending many months of my year in the United States, Canada, and Europe speaking on the Middle East, on Israeli politics, and on Islam, of course. And one of the things I've noticed is that there are two types of people who call themselves Christians. And, I don't mean to be mean to any specific Christian group, but for example, out of 2 billion Christians, 1.2 billion are Catholic. They follow the Pope. Catholics are great people, but the policy of the church in Rome is against Israel, basically, because they go with where their worshipers are. The worshipers are primarily in Arabic countries, Islamic countries, not in Israel. And they have all their real estate to protect.
Sure.
The Orthodox Christians in Russia, the Balkans, Egypt, Ethiopia, 300 million of them still say that the Jews killed Christ, which of course is nonsense. Even the Catholics got rid of that with Vatican II. So that's already, we're talking about 1.5 billion Christians who are not pro-Israel. Then of the 500 million that remain, more than half are the established churches, mainline churches, and most of them are anti-Israel for political reasons. And that leaves us about 200 million evangelicals, of which half believe in replacement theology, which means they're not with Israel. And so my people, my Christians, are about the 100 million evangelicals who support Israel. And my message has been for the last 28 years that Israel needs to develop a strong relationship with these evangelicals, with all Christians, but those who follow the Bible, evangelicals, truly, they understand that Israel is the apple of God's eye, and that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. Now I'm going to answer your question. The Christians in Israel bless Israel, but they are not being blessed, in my opinion. I mean, they're being blessed in general, but they have no representation in our parliament and our Knesset. 2% of our Christians, 2% of our population is Arabic-speaking Christian, but they are divided against each other because half are Catholic and half are Greek Orthodox. If you go back to the schism, the split in 1053, then we had 1 million people coming from the former Soviet Union. Of the 1 million, 30% are not Jewish by the rabbinate's considerations. So that's 300,000 Christians or non-Jews entered Israel with the massive immigration. So today, the Christian population in Israel is 8%. 6% of the population is Jewish, married to the 8%. So my potential constituency today is 14%. And these people have absolutely not even one representative in the Knesset. And so my plan has been for the last 20 years to start a party, build a party, run in the elections, and hopefully get Christian candidates in on the basis of parity. In other words, candidates 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9 will be Jews, and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 will be Christians. And so I'm working now on building the membership of the party. You have to remember, it took me 28 years to become known, like to people like you, for example.
Right.
20 years, 1,000 churches, 1,000 radio and TV shows. Now I'm here in Israel. I have 3 months to put together a party and run for office and get elected. So there's I would say, a reasonable probability I will not get into the next Knesset. But in a few years, we have elections again. So this is just the beginning of my march to the Knesset. If I don't get in these elections in 3 months, I'll get in 4 years. And then if not, then in 8 years, I'll still be 2 years younger than Moses.
No, you have a long and storied career and history of talking with and attending and going to Christian churches across the United States, Canada, I think Western Europe, and presenting the case for Israel. The idea that you have to create a party for Christians in Israel is great. It's very novel. It's it is a constituency that most people don't know, and it's a party that, assuming that it's reasonably pro-Israel, and I don't necessarily assume that, by the way, but let's say for the sake of argument, that's a party that could make great international connections with Christian nations and Christian people all over the world.
That's exactly my consideration. And you have to remember that, for example, the Russian and Ukrainian Jews and Christians who made Aliyah, who moved to Israel, all of them serve in the Israeli army. They get their guts blown out on the battlefield. They get buried in the, together with the Jews. So you tell me that if they're not blessing Israel. Of course they're blessing Israel.
Of course.
So therefore, these Christians should be blessed. Also seeing a move by the Arabic-speaking Christians away from the hatred that knew all these 2,000 years. And now many Arabic-speaking Christians are joining the Israeli army as well, and looking at the Jews as brothers and sisters, and that indeed the group that is killing them is not the Jews. The group that is killing the Arabic-speaking Christians is ISIS. And so this is something that we're watching very closely in the countries neighboring us. I know one Arabic-speaking Christian in Nazareth who said to me that his neighbor, who was a Muslim, said to him, "Hey, you see what we're doing to you guys in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq? Well, guess what? We're going to do it to you here in Israel also." So the Arabic-speaking Christians are waking up and realizing that the Israeli Jews are their brothers and sisters, not their enemies.
No, I mean, you're bringing up, of course, a bigger issue that's rarely discussed in the United States or anywhere else, and that is the Holocaust against Christians in the Arab countries right now. We've seen
Correct.
even last week an attempt to blow up a Christian church in Egypt, a Coptic church. Christians in Aramaic-speaking Christians in Syria have been massacred. We've seen very highly publicized pictures of ISIS really putting Christians literally on a cross, crucifying them, and doing other atrocities to their Christian populations. And we have regions now which are being stripped of Christians. And we should note, just as a historical fact, that these all were Christian countries before they were taken over by Muslim forces coming out of Saudi Arabia or Arabia. I mean, Egypt, Syria, Palestine for that matter, North Africa, these were Christian nations that were conquered by Muslim forces in the 8th century, toward the end of the 8th century. So, you have indigenous people. Where are all the people that like to talk about indigenous people being persecuted and driven out of their country right now? So you're really bringing an issue to the fore by establishing this party. Many issues, not just Israeli politics, and giving people a constituency, a voice in Israel. As you say, 8 to 9% of the population. But you're also shining a light on this Holocaust that's occurring throughout the Middle East, and you're hopefully going to reach American Christians, although I wouldn't hold my breath on that, but you'll reach some who actually are sincere and conscious Christians, to the extent that any of them are. All right, I want to ask you about the business of Benjamin Netanyahu and the troubles that he's facing with these constant accusations. Is he going to retain power? Should he retain power? Is Benny Gantz a serious threat to him, former military general? What's going on in Israeli politics?
Well, I'll give you the example of President Trump. Remember, President Trump said that if he shot somebody dead on Fifth Avenue, he'd still be elected president.
Oh, yeah.
Same with Netanyahu. Even if he's convicted, we feel that the court system, the judges, kind of like the Supreme Court before Trump got elected, tended to be to the left, tended to be anti-conservative. Israel has a tradition of being socialist.
Yeah.
Joseph Stalin, I don't know, many of your listeners maybe don't even know who Joseph Stalin was, the dictator of Soviet Union. He was one of the first leaders to recognize the Jewish state of Israel in 1948. Why? Because he was sure that Israel was going to join the Soviet bloc, because the communist and socialist parties were the majority at that time. And he was really sure that Israel would become part of the Soviet bloc. Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, to his credit, said, hey, wait a second. We got 6 million Jews in America and Jews in other places. We are going to be neutral in the Cold War. And when he said neutral, Stalin went berserk. It was like a stab in the back to the communist system. And Ben-Gurion said, I'm going to be neutral in the Cold War because we have Jews everywhere in the world. And so basically, the Russians then transferred, the communists, the Soviets, transferred their support straight over to the Abdel Nasser in Egypt and the other, pro-socialist regimes, all the Arab regimes against Israel. And then, as you know, as the years went by, Soviet system collapsed. At first was Boris Yeltsin, who was pro-Israel. Putin actually comes from a very pro-Israel background. He grew up with Jewish kids. You do have, of course, the old-timer, hardcore anti-Semites in the Russian military and system. But, we watch very closely everything that's going on in Russia. President Putin is a friend of the Jews who live in Russia. He is coordinating, or at least the Russian military is coordinating everything that's going on in Syria with the Israeli military. We're doing everything we can to avoid friction with the Russians. And I don't know if you remember in your history books, in 1939, there was a war between Finland and Russia.
Right.
And I was just in Finland, and I met with some people at the military college there. And they said to me, even though we could have really whipped the Russians, but there's a saying, if you're a wily fox, you still have to be very careful of the Russian bear.
Mm-hmm. Well, they certainly did, because they were right next door, and they fought a very incredible war to preserve their independence without any help from anyone. So, but Russia today is plays. It's always played a kind of a strange game, anyways. In a way, they seem to have picked up from the old British Empire this kind of divide and conquer approach. I wrote a book called The Nazi Connection of Islamic Terrorism, where I talk about the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and how he was able to get British support in the British Mandate of Palestine, and then go on to Nazi Germany, where Hitler set him up as the Arab Nazi government, head of government in exile. After the defeat of the Nazis, of course, the Soviets picked up the cudgels, as you point out, when Ben-Gurion tilted toward the United States. I think it was more than neutral. It was a little bit of a tilt in the direction of the West and the Western democracies. And so the war goes on. You have this strange, unholy alliance between the radical Islamists and the left that seems to permeate. And when I say the left in the United States, I'm even including the Jewish left in that. You've got people who are so-called anti-Zionists now, various movements, and they're supporting them. Might as well join Hamas, as far as I can tell. Where do things stand as such in terms of Israel's cultural influence, if you will, in the world? Because at the same time as I see this, just the usual anti-Semites, both on the left, the BDS crowd, and the old left, the old right, which isn't really all that relevant right now. And then, of course, the third spoke on the wheel is the Islamists. Yet at the same time, I see Israel as continuing as a vibrant, dynamic nation, making inroads with Arab nations. Having normalization, for example, with some of the Gulf states. I mean, didn't Netanyahu recently visit Oman, where he was publicly greeted by the Sultan Qaboos? Where is Israel, in your opinion? I know I'm asking kind of a broad question, but where do they stand culturally at this point in the world?
Well, I'm going to say something also which you ask, but I'm going to answer it. And the question is about Palestinian terrorism. And frankly, Palestinian terrorism is very minuscule. We are living alongside 2 million Muslims in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. And we have 2 million Muslims living as Israeli citizens. That's 4 million. And of course, we have 2 million in Gaza, which I don't talk about that now because it's as if they have their own state.
Right.
But you look, 4 million Muslims living with us, and these people are so happy. I mean, they hate the Jews because of Islam, but they're so happy living under Israeli rule. And every so often, once a week, once every 2 weeks, you find some kind of a really bad terrorist attack. Let's say 50 terrorist attacks a year. out of 4 million Muslims living with us, it just shows that the vast, overwhelming majority of Arabic-speaking, people in Israel are I won't say they're pro-Israel, but they're not going to come out in the streets and start a war with us. Now, similarly, the message is not lost on Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. The real threat to the Arabs and to Israel is Iran. And you're right, we see signs of some kind of a crumbling in Iran right now, but we're looking at a war of 1,400 years between the Sunnis, with whom Israel and America are allied, and the Shiites who are allied with Russia. And you have to remember that the Russians have a history of 1,000 years fighting the Turks, who are Sunni Muslims. And so who are the enemies of the Turks? The Shiites, the Iranians. I'm talking now historically.
Yep.
And so the Russians go with the enemies of the enemies, and America goes with the Sunnis because the Sunnis are selling oil to the world. And the Sunnis are very much part of the world economic order. And I think Trump himself even said a number of times that he's not going to do some stupid decision regarding Khashoggi and his assassination being chopped up and thrown into the acid bin, because America and the world needs a stable Saudi Arabia. I have to tell you something. You know about this war in Yemen between the Houthis and who are Iranian-backed and the Sunnis backed by Saudi.
Right.
But the northwestern tip of Yemen if you look at the map, it's about an 8-hour drive away from Mecca, which is the holiest place for all Muslims. And so this is really a battle for domination in the Islamic world. Will it be the Sunnis or the Shiites? And so I think at this stage, the hatred of the Shiites is greater than the hatred of the Jews.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I think that Israel seems to be safer when you have its enemies divided, of course. And I mean, look, maybe we're opening the lens here and looking at something in terms of centuries, but I believe that Islam generally is in a major state of decline around the world, has been for centuries, has been since the Battle of Lepanto when the Turks were defeated. And in a way, the whole business of radical Islam and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that's like a response to that. It's an attempt, a last gasp attempt to grab the old, hegemonic, militant Islam that came out from the days of Mohammed. But the reality is that they're receding. They're either receding in that they're becoming westernized, or if you will, even Christianized in the United States, and that they're turning their back literally on Islam, if not while keeping some of the trappings, or the real core of it is in decline. I mean, those countries don't create anything. They don't produce anything. They're poor. And we're talking about countries that have enormous resources and oil and wealth, but yet the people continue to be kept in this authoritarian, backward condition. And that can't last forever. So I think that, looking at the long lens, Israel it continues to be a contrast to that, which is one of the reasons why I think they hate Israel, that it shows that a small nation can be sovereign, can be prosperous, can be democratic, and can have freedoms of religion and everything else. And that's a threat to this whole rotten, old Islamic way of life and thinking. And, I just admire, I think that, I would appeal to average Muslims and say, take a look at Israel and try to model a nation after that as a sovereign Muslim nation. I mean, this is what King Faisal of Syria wanted to do when he signed the Faisal-Weizmann Accords in 1919 as part of the Paris Peace Conference. He became king of Syria and then king of Iraq. And the Accords actually say, we welcome the Jewish people back to their ancestral homeland, but we expect them to work alongside us as we try to build modern national homelands. And of course, their only condition that Faisal put in that document, which was a recognition by the Arab world of Israel's right to exist, he was the de facto and authority leader of the Islamic world at the time, was that Israel respect the rights of the Muslim minority and they respect Muslim holy places, something Israel has done. Maybe not perfectly, but they've done it to a very high degree. So I hope that Israel and people watching the program and who might have this anti-Israel orientation, they think about what Israel does stand for, and these are universal themes. And they look to Israel as an inspiration against colonialism, against imperialism, against oppression, and try to emulate that for their own countries to develop sovereign nations. Anyways, Avi, I don't want to make a speech here, but we're reaching toward the end of the program. So could you mention to my listeners where people can get your excellent books, where they can get more information about your political party? I'll be posting that on the YouTube station and sending you a link to that. So, but please go ahead and do that.
Okay, well, I've written seven books. The last four, I believe, are on Amazon. They're on Amazon, and I think they're on Kindle. But otherwise, they can also be ordered from my website, avilipkin.net. And people can write to me at avilipkin.net, and I'll be glad to answer. I'm still in a stage where I'm not elected to the Knesset, so I have time to, not too much time, but I have some time to answer people writing to me. So avilipkin.net, look for my books. My most recent book, actually, is about Syria and about Russia and Turkey and Iran. And so I think it's called the Islamic Rivalry. And then I have other books also. I think if you're a book person, we are now in the middle of the winter, and you like to cuddle next to the fireplace and read a book, I've got 7 books. They're all very different from each other, all about similar topics. And one of them is about the political party, the Bible Bloc. And I think, people will find it a good way to support what I'm doing and the party. We cannot receive contributions anymore for the party. So the best way to help me is to buy books. I also have CDs and DVDs, which are available from the website. And I will not be traveling anymore until April 9th, unless I get rejected from the Knesset.
Yep.
And then that means I'll be there in April or May.
Very good. Let's hope. God willing. All right, Avi Lipkin, listen, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. It's great talking to you again. Let's stay in touch. Please drop me a note if you've got anything you want to talk about, and we'll continue working together. So thanks a lot, Avi.
God bless you. God bless America.
Thank you, Avi. All right.